10 nuclear submarines in a single year. The achievement that sent shockwaves through the Soviet intelligence apparatus in the 1960s was not just a technical marvel, but a pivotal moment in the Cold War's underwater chess game. What the Kremlin's analysts initially dismissed as American propaganda soon materialized as an industrial achievement they could scarcely comprehend. The United States' ability to construct an entire fleet of nuclear-powered submarines at a pace that defied the conventional wisdom of naval construction. This wasn't merely a quantitative leap. It represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power beneath the waves, where Soviet and American forces played an increasingly dangerous game of hide-and-seek with nuclear arsenals. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The date was February 12, 1967. Inside a nondescript building in Moscow's Yasenevo district, KGB analyst Mikhail Leonov stared in disbelief at the report on his desk. American intelligence had successfully misled Soviet operatives for months, concealing the true scale of the U.S. Navy's submarine production capabilities. What was initially believed to be a gradual expansion of America's underwater fleet was revealed to be something far more ambitious and threatening. The United States had managed to commission 10 nuclear submarines in a single calendar year, a feat that Soviet engineers had deemed technologically impossible. "This changes everything," Leonov reportedly told his superior, Colonel Yuri Modin. "Their industrial capacity exceeds our estimates by at least 300%. The Soviet Union, which had prided itself on maintaining parity with American military developments, found itself suddenly and decisively outpaced in one of the most critical domains of the Cold War. For the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis 5 years earlier, genuine panic spread through the upper echelons of Soviet military leadership. If the Americans could build nuclear submarines at this rate, what else were they capable of? The intelligence blindside represented not just a military challenge, but an ideological one, a direct challenge to the Soviet claim of industrial and technological superiority. The submarine revolution that so alarmed Soviet intelligence didn't materialize overnight. Its roots traced back to January 21, 1954, when the USS Nautilus, the world's first nuclear-powered submarine, was launched from the Electric Boat Shipyard in Groton, Connecticut. First Lady Mamie Eisenhower christened the vessel before a crowd of 15,000 spectators. When Nautilus Commander Eugene Wilkinson sent the historic message, "Underway on nuclear power," on January 17, 1955, he was unknowingly initiating a new era in naval warfare, one where submarines could remain submerged indefinitely, limited only by crew endurance and food supplies rather than battery life or fuel constraints. Admiral Hyman Rickover, known as the father of the nuclear navy, had pushed relentlessly for the development of nuclear propulsion against significant institutional resistance. A Polish immigrant who rose through the ranks with fierce determination, Rickover created a parallel organization within the Navy that reported directly to the Atomic Energy Commission and Congress, bypassing much of the traditional naval bureaucracy. His demanding standards and uncompromising approach alienated many, but resulted in an engineering marvel, a nuclear propulsion system that would never suffer a single reactor accident in the history of the U.S. Navy. "Any system we cannot explain in a straightforward fashion," Rickover once said, "is one we do not fully understand." This philosophy of absolute mastery over technology would propel the American submarine program far ahead of its Soviet counterpart, which struggled with reliability issues for decades. The Nautilus proved the concept, but it was the subsequent Skate-class submarines that demonstrated the possibility of serial production. 4 Skate-class vessels were commissioned between 1957 and 1959, proving that nuclear submarines could be built with reasonable efficiency. Yet even this achievement didn't prepare the Soviets for what would follow. By 1961, as the Berlin crisis escalated and the Cold War intensified, President Kennedy authorized a massive expansion of America's strategic forces. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, the systems analyst who had revolutionized Ford Motor Company's production methods, applied similar principles to military procurement. The submarine fleet became a primary beneficiary of this approach. The Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Virginia and Electric Boat in Connecticut underwent radical transformations. New modular construction techniques allowed submarine components to be built simultaneously rather than sequentially. Specialized manufacturing facilities were established for reactor components, dramatically reducing production time. The results were staggering. While the Nautilus had taken more than 3 years from keel laying to commissioning, by the mid-1960s, this timeline had been compressed to just over 18 months. The Soviet Union had its own nuclear submarine program, beginning with the November-class attack submarine, NATO designation, launched in 1958. But the Russian boats suffered from serious reliability problems. The early Soviet reactors were prone to leaks and required frequent maintenance. Their submarines were notably louder than their American counterparts, making them easier to track. The gap in quality was substantial, but Soviet leaders consoled themselves with the belief that they could at least maintain numerical parity. This illusion was shattered by America's production breakthrough in the mid-1960s. The 10 submarines commissioned in a single year included a mix of attack submarines, SSNs, and ballistic missile submarines, SSBNs. Each represented different aspects of American underwater supremacy. The attack submarines could hunt and potentially destroy Soviet submarines, while the ballistic missile submarines carried Polaris missiles capable of delivering nuclear warheads to targets deep inside Soviet territory. One of these submarines, the USS Will Rogers, SSBN 659, was commissioned on April 1, 1967, named after the American humorist. The submarine was the last of the 41 Polaris submarines. When it slipped beneath the waves for its first patrol, it carried 16 Polaris A-3 missiles, each with a range of 2,500 nautical miles and equipped with multiple warheads. The submarine could remain submerged for months, moving silently through the ocean depths, its location unknown even to most American military leaders. From the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean, these submarines created a mobile, virtually undetectable nuclear deterrent that the Soviet Union could not counter. The 41 for Freedom, as these ballistic missile submarines were collectively known, represented an unprecedented concentration of nuclear firepower. Each submarine carried more destructive capability than all the bombs dropped in World War II combined. Their deployment fundamentally changed strategic calculations on both sides of the Iron Curtain. The massive acceleration in submarine production was made possible by an extraordinary convergence of political will, economic capacity, and technological innovation. The United States in the 1960s was at the peak of its industrial might, with a GDP more than double that of the Soviet Union. American shipyards employed tens of thousands of skilled workers, many of them veterans who had gained experience during the massive naval construction programs of World War II. Newport News Shipbuilding, founded in 1886, had built vessels for both World Wars and was constantly investing in new facilities and techniques. Electric Boat, a division of General Dynamics, had constructed the first commissioned submarine for the U.S. Navy in 1900 and had been refining its methods ever since. When called upon to accelerate production, these shipyards had both the infrastructure and the institutional knowledge to respond. The political dimension was equally important. Following the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, when the world had come perilously close to nuclear war, both Kennedy and his successor Lyndon Johnson prioritized strategic capabilities that would provide maximum deterrence with minimum vulnerability. Submarines fit this requirement perfectly. Unlike bombers, they couldn't be caught on the ground in a surprise attack. Unlike land-based missiles, they couldn't be targeted by an enemy first strike. They were, as strategic theorists noted, the perfect second strike weapon. ensuring that even if the United States were hit first, a devastating counterattack could still be launched. Congress proved willing to fund this undersea expansion generously. The fiscal year 1963 defense budget alone allocated over $3 billion, equivalent to about $27 billion today, specifically for nuclear submarine construction and related technologies. This represented a massive investment, but one that had broad bipartisan support. Democratic Senator Henry Scoop Jackson of Washington, a key figure on the Armed Services Committee, worked closely with Republican colleagues to ensure that submarine funding remained a priority regardless of which party controlled the White House or Congress. Inside the Soviet intelligence apparatus, the American submarine breakthrough triggered an intensive reassessment. KGB and GRU, military intelligence officers stationed in the United States, were tasked with penetrating the security surrounding the submarine construction programs. Soviet diplomatic personnel in Connecticut and Virginia were instructed to recruit sources within the shipyards, an effort that largely failed due to the robust counterintelligence measures implemented by the FBI and naval intelligence. Some of the most valuable intelligence came from open sources, trade publications, local newspapers in shipbuilding communities, and congressional testimony. American security was tight regarding specific technologies, particularly propulsion systems and acoustic silencing techniques. But the general pace of construction was difficult to conceal completely. Soviet analysts pieced together fragmentary information, gradually building a picture that confirmed their worst fears. The United States had achieved a decisive advantage in undersea warfare. The Soviet response was multifaceted. Immediately, resources were diverted to accelerate their own submarine programs. The construction of the Yankee-class ballistic missile submarines began in 1967, with the first boat launched in 1968. These vessels were markedly superior to previous Soviet designs, though still not matching the capabilities of their American counterparts. Simultaneously, the Soviet Union invested heavily in anti-submarine warfare capabilities, developing new sensors, weapons, and tactics aimed specifically at detecting and potentially neutralizing American submarines. More broadly, the submarine gap contributed to a general reassessment of Soviet military strategy. The realization that they could not match American production capacity led to an increased emphasis on asymmetric approaches, investments, in areas where the USSR believed it could achieve superiority, or at least parity at lower cost. This included the development of air defense systems, anti-ship missiles, and eventually space-based military technologies. The human dimension of this submarine race remained largely hidden from public view. In the United States, thousands of sailors volunteered for the submarine service, undergoing rigorous selection and training. The nuclear-trained personnel were among the military's elite, required to master complex systems and endure the psychological challenges of prolonged underwater deployments. Captain James Calvert, who commanded the USS Skate during its historic surfacing at the North Pole in 1959, later wrote about the unique pressures of submarine command. The submarine skipper stands alone in a way that few other men can understand. There is no one to share his burden of responsibility, no one to consult in moments of crisis. Life aboard these early nuclear submarines was demanding. Crews typically followed an 18-hour cycle rather than the normal 24-hour day, with 6 hours on watch and 12 hours off. Personal space was minimal. Many sailors hot-bunked, sharing the same berth with someone on an opposite watch schedule. The environment was filled with the constant hum of machinery, and sailors could go weeks without seeing natural light or breathing fresh air. Yet morale was generally high, sustained by a strong sense of purpose and the elite status of the submarine service. One officer aboard the USS Daniel Boone, one of the submarines commissioned during this period, later recalled, "We knew we were making history, but more importantly, we believed we were preventing a war. Every day we remained undetected was a day the Soviets had to reckon with the fact that they could never be certain of eliminating our retaliatory capability. The technological achievements that enabled this submarine revolution were kept closely guarded. Particularly significant was the development of advanced silencing technologies. Early nuclear submarines, while revolutionary in their propulsion systems, were still relatively noisy by later standards. The reactor cooling pumps, reduction gears, and propellers all generated sound that could potentially be detected by enemy sensors. American engineers developed innovative solutions to these challenges, mounting equipment on sound-isolating platforms, designing new propeller shapes that minimized cavitation, the formation and collapse of bubbles that creates noise, and creating anechoic coatings that absorbed rather than reflected sound waves. These advancements weren't merely incremental, they represented fundamental breakthroughs in submarine design. By the late 1960s, American submarines had become so quiet that they could approach Soviet naval formations without detection, a capability demonstrated during numerous classified operations. One submarine commander reported being able to track a Soviet vessel for days without the target having any indication it was being followed. The acceleration in submarine construction also drove innovations in missile technology. The Polaris missile system underwent continuous refinement, with the A-3 version deployed in 1964 having significantly greater range and accuracy than its predecessors. Development was already underway for its successor, the Poseidon C-3, which would carry multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles, MIRVs, allowing a single missile to strike multiple targets. This technology would further multiply the strategic impact of each submarine. In congressional testimony in 1967, Vice Admiral Hyman Rickover, never one for understatement, declared, "The Soviet Union recognizes that it has failed to match our capability in submarine propulsion and sound silencing. They are making extraordinary efforts to close this gap, but they remain years behind." While Rickover was known for using such statements to secure continued funding for his programs, subsequent historical analysis has confirmed the essential accuracy of his assessment. The production achievement also reflected changes in American industrial methods. The shipyards adopted techniques from other manufacturing sectors, including the use of computer-aided design, still in its infancy, and precision machining technologies that ensured components would fit together perfectly without time-consuming adjustments. Quality control systems were revolutionized with stringent testing at every stage of construction. The Rickover effect extended throughout the submarine industrial base, with suppliers held to unprecedented standards of precision and reliability. Meanwhile, in the political realm, the submarine race became an element in the broader strategic dialogue between the superpowers. American officials occasionally allowed carefully selected information about submarine capabilities to reach Soviet intelligence, reinforcing the message that the USSR could not win an arms race in this domain. At the same time, other details were protected with extraordinary measures, creating an intentional uncertainty about exactly what the American submarines could do. This pattern of selective revelation and concealment was part of the complex signaling that characterized Cold War deterrence. The goal was to convince Soviet leaders that aggression would be futile, without providing them specific information that might help them counter American advantages. As Thomas Schelling, the Nobel Prize-winning strategist, observed, "Deterrence is about affecting the enemy's expectations, not merely their capabilities." By late 1967, as the reality of America's submarine advantage became undeniable, internal debates intensified within the Soviet leadership. Some military figures advocated for a massive investment to try to close the gap, while others argued that resources should be directed toward areas where the USSR might achieve more immediate parity. Ultimately, a compromise approach prevailed. The submarine program would be accelerated, but not at the expense of other strategic priorities like intercontinental ballistic missiles and air defense systems. For the submariners themselves, the strategic importance of their mission was clear. But daily life remained focused on the immediate challenges of operating some of the most complex machines ever built. Commander Thomas Maloney, who took command of the USS Guardfish in 1968, later described the intense concentration required. Every sound you hear could be normal equipment operation, or it could be the first indication of a system failure that might endanger the boat. You develop an almost supernatural sensitivity to the sounds and rhythms of your submarine. This sensitivity extended to interactions with the underwater environment. Submarine officers became students of oceanography, learning to use temperature layers, salinity gradients, and other natural phenomena to hide their vessels or enhance their sonar capabilities. The underwater domain became a three-dimensional battlefield where knowledge of environmental conditions could provide a decisive advantage. For the intelligence officers monitoring these developments, both American and Soviet, the submarine race presented unique challenges. Traditional espionage methods were often ineffective against targets that spent most of their time deep underwater in unknown locations. New approaches to intelligence collection emerged, including the use of specialized aircraft to track submarine movements during their brief periods near the surface, and the deployment of underwater listening arrays to detect submarines at long distances. One of the most sensitive programs, still partially classified today, involved American submarines being sent to monitor Soviet naval facilities, sometimes venturing daringly close to Soviet territorial waters. These intelligence-gathering missions provided crucial information about Soviet capabilities and operational patterns, while demonstrating the superior stealth of American submarines. By December 1967, as the year's final submarine joined the fleet, the United States had established an advantage in undersea warfare that would endure for decades. The achievement represented not just industrial might, but a complex integration of scientific advancement, military doctrine, and political commitment. It demonstrated that in certain critical domains, the qualitative and quantitative edges could align to create a decisive strategic advantage. Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin, receiving updated intelligence assessments in early 1968, reportedly asked his defense minister, "How many years would it take us to build 10 nuclear submarines?" The answer that even with maximum effort, the Soviet Union could not match this production rate before the mid-1970s, underscored the significance of the American achievement. The submarine gap would influence Soviet strategic thinking throughout the remainder of the Cold War. As the United States consolidated its undersea advantage, a new pattern of operations emerged. American submarines began conducting more aggressive intelligence-gathering missions, penetrating what the Soviets considered their secure maritime spaces. The USS Halibut, specially modified for intelligence purposes, conducted a series of classified operations against Soviet targets, including what is believed to have been the first successful tapping of an undersea communications cable in the Sea of Okhotsk in 1968. These operations provided intelligence of extraordinary value, including details of Soviet nuclear command and control systems that influenced American strategic planning for years. The crews of these submarines operated under extraordinary secrecy. Many of their missions remain classified even today, acknowledged only in general terms or through unofficial channels. The submarines would depart their bases with their destinations and objectives known only to a handful of senior officers. Families were told nothing beyond the expected duration of the deployment. Even many years later, veterans of these missions speak about them only in the most general terms, honoring security classifications that have outlasted the Cold War itself. One submariner, who served aboard the USS James Madison during this period, recalled in a 2010 interview, "We would be at sea for months with no communication, except the most basic status reports. Our families had no idea where we were or what we were doing. But we understood the stakes. Every successful patrol meant the deterrent was working. Every time we returned safely home meant the world was still at peace. This peace, however uneasy, was secured in part by the silent hunters patrolling beneath the waves, vessels, whose very existence represented an industrial and technological achievement that had fundamentally altered the strategic landscape. The 10 nuclear submarines commissioned in a single year had changed the Cold War in ways that would only become fully apparent in retrospect. For the men who built them and the crews who sailed them, it was more than a technical achievement. It was a contribution to history, a role in the long twilight struggle that defined their generation. As the new year of 1968 dawned, Soviet intelligence analysts were still coming to terms with the implications of America's submarine breakthrough. For the shipyard workers in Newport News and Groton who had made this achievement possible, there was little opportunity to rest on their laurels. New submarine classes were already on the drawing boards, incorporating lessons learned from the current generation and pushing the boundaries of underwater technology even further. The race beneath the waves, a race that would help determine the outcome of the Cold War, was entering a new and even more consequential phase. As 1968 progressed, the strategic implications of America's submarine achievement began to reverberate through multiple dimensions of the Cold War. The 10 nuclear submarines commissioned the previous year weren't merely additions to the fleet, they represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power. Each silent vessel patrolling the depths carried enough firepower to devastate dozens of Soviet cities, yet remained virtually immune to detection or preemptive attack. For Soviet military planners, this created a nightmare scenario, an adversary with both overwhelming firepower and near-perfect concealment. In March 1968, an incident occurred that would dramatically underscore the growing submarine gap. The Soviet Golf II-class ballistic missile submarine K-129 mysteriously sank in the Pacific Ocean, approximately 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii. While the exact cause remains disputed to this day, what followed was unprecedented. The CIA, working with Howard Hughes Company as cover, launched Project Azorian to secretly recover the sunken Soviet submarine from a depth of 3 miles. This extraordinarily complex operation, not fully revealed to the public until decades later, demonstrated the technological gap between the superpowers in undersea capabilities. While attempting to locate the K-129, the Americans deployed one of their newly commissioned nuclear submarines equipped with advanced sonar systems that could detect vessels at unprecedented ranges. According to declassified documents, this submarine operated undetected within Soviet patrol areas for weeks, gathering intelligence and demonstrating a level of acoustic stealth that alarmed Soviet naval experts when they later learned of it. The American technological edge extended beyond the submarines themselves to the entire supporting infrastructure. At the Atlantic Undersea Test and Evaluation Center, AUTEC, in the Bahamas, the U.S. Navy had established sophisticated facilities for measuring submarine acoustic signatures and testing new silencing technologies. Similar facilities in the Pacific allowed submarines to refine their stealth capabilities in realistic conditions. The Soviet Union had nothing comparable, relying instead on less sophisticated methods that provided incomplete data about their vessels' detectability. Meanwhile, the strategic significance of the submarine force was being integrated into broader U.S. policy. National Security Advisor Walt Rostow, in a classified memorandum to President Johnson dated April 12, 1968, wrote, "Our submarine advantage represents perhaps the single most important asymmetric capability we possess vis-à-vis the Soviet Union. It provides a guarantee that, regardless of developments in other areas of competition, the fundamental strategic balance remains favorable to the United States." This advantage was not merely theoretical. Throughout 1968 and 1969, American submarines conducted numerous classified operations that demonstrated their superior capabilities. The USS Lapon, an attack submarine commissioned during the production surge, tracked a Soviet Yankee-class ballistic missile submarine for a record 47 days without being detected. The USS Guardfish, another product of the accelerated construction program, penetrated Soviet-claimed waters in the Sea of Japan to gather intelligence on new Soviet naval deployments. These operations provided invaluable information while reinforcing to Soviet leaders the reality of American undersea dominance. The human element remained central to maintaining this advantage. The Navy's nuclear propulsion training program, personally overseen by Admiral Rickover, became renowned for its rigor and selectivity. Potential submarine officers underwent intensive interviews with Rickover himself, facing his legendary questioning designed to test not just their technical knowledge, but their character and judgment under pressure. One candidate recalled being asked, "How much do you weigh?" When he answered, Rickover immediately responded, "I think you're too fat for the nuclear program." The startled officer replied, "Sir, I meet all the Navy's physical requirements." Rickover stared at him silently for almost a minute before saying, "I'll ask the questions. Tell me about your undergraduate research in thermodynamics." Those who passed Rickover's scrutiny entered a training program of unprecedented intensity. The Nuclear Power School in Orlando, Florida, compressed the equivalent of years of engineering education into 6 months of 16-hour days. Students mastered reactor physics, thermodynamics, electrical engineering, chemistry, material science, and a host of specialized subjects. The dropout rate was significant, but those who completed the program emerged with technical expertise that was unmatched in any other military service. The submarine crews developed a distinctive culture that blended technical precision with pragmatic adaptability. Unlike surface ships, submarines operated with minimal external supervision, requiring a level of initiative and self-sufficiency rarely found in military organizations. Junior officers often made critical decisions that would have been reserved for senior commanders in other contexts. This culture of empowerment and accountability became another American advantage, allowing submarines to operate effectively in the absence of detailed instructions from higher authority. One submarine executive officer later described the selection process. "We weren't looking for just technical competence or just leadership ability. We needed people who could maintain absolute concentration on complex tasks for extended periods, who could make sound decisions under extreme pressure, and who could live in very close quarters for months without conflict." Finding people with all these qualities was challenging but essential to our mission. The psychological aspects of submarine service received increasing attention. Prolonged underwater deployments created unique stresses, especially on ballistic missile submarines that typically spent 60-70 days submerged during each patrol. The crews lived in an artificial environment of recycled air, processed water, and constant machinery noise, never seeing natural light or experiencing weather. Maintaining mental health under these conditions required specialized approaches developed through years of operational experience. Captain William Peerenboom, who commanded the USS Daniel Webster during this period, instituted what became known as the Peerenboom Protocol, a systematic rotation of activities to prevent monotony, including educational programs, hobby workshops, and regular celebrations of milestones during long patrols. "The mind needs variety as much as the body needs food," he noted in his command journal. Without it, performance degrades in ways that may not be immediately obvious, but can become critical in emergency situations. These human factors extended to the Soviet side as well. As the USSR struggled to close the submarine gap, they pushed their technology and personnel to the limits, sometimes with tragic results. In 1968, the Soviet K-27 submarine suffered a serious nuclear reactor accident during a test cruise in the Barents Sea, resulting in 9 deaths and multiple radiation injuries. The incident, kept secret for decades, highlighted the dangers of attempting to match American capabilities without equivalent safety systems and training. Throughout this period, both superpowers engaged in a complex dance of intelligence gathering and counterintelligence. The United States established an elaborate system to track Soviet submarines, including the Sound Surveillance System, SOSUS, a network of underwater hydrophones positioned along strategic ocean channels. This system could detect Soviet submarines at great distances, providing early warning of any unusual deployments. The Soviets, aware of SOSUS but unable to counter it effectively, were forced to operate with the knowledge that their movements were likely being monitored. In response, the USSR increased its human intelligence efforts, attempting to penetrate the security surrounding American submarine technology. In July 1968, a Soviet intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover in Washington was caught attempting to recruit an engineer from Electric Boat. The FBI, which had been monitoring the Soviet official, arrested both individuals. The engineer turned out to be a counterintelligence operative working with naval intelligence, but the incident demonstrated the priority that Soviet intelligence placed on acquiring submarine secrets. By late 1968, the strategic implications of the submarine gap had become a factor in the nascent arms control negotiations between the superpowers. The Soviet Union, recognizing that it could not achieve parity in this domain in the near term, sought to limit the American advantage through diplomatic means. The first Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, which would eventually begin in November 1969, were shaped in part by this reality. The Soviet negotiating position emphasized limitations on missile numbers rather than delivery platforms, an approach that would allow them to address their most pressing strategic concerns while avoiding drawing attention to areas of American superiority. As the Johnson administration prepared to hand over power to Richard Nixon in January 1969, a comprehensive assessment of the strategic balance was prepared for the incoming president. The classified document, portions of which were declassified in the 1990s, stated, "The United States maintains a significant qualitative advantage in submarine-launched ballistic missile systems that is expected to persist for at least the next 5 years. This advantage derives from superior quieting technology, more reliable propulsion systems, and more accurate missile guidance. The quantitative advantage in deployment numbers, dramatically demonstrated by last year's commissioning rate, reinforces this position of strength. The Nixon administration would leverage this advantage in its pursuit of détente with the Soviet Union." National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, a master of realpolitik, understood that negotiating from a position of strength would yield better results than negotiating from parity. The submarine gap provided precisely such leverage, a capability the Soviets could neither match in the short term nor neutralize through other means. For the shipyard workers and engineers who had made the submarine breakthrough possible, the transition to a new administration brought no reduction in the pace of innovation. New submarine classes were already under development, incorporating lessons learned from operational experience and pushing the boundaries of underwater technology even further. The Los Angeles-class attack submarines, which would begin construction in 1972, represented another quantum leap in capabilities, with significantly reduced acoustic signatures and enhanced weapon systems. The broader industrial ecosystem that supported the submarine program continued to evolve. Specialized manufacturers developed components that could withstand the extreme pressures of deep ocean operations while maintaining absolute reliability. Material science advanced to create hull structures capable of diving deeper than ever before. Computer systems, still in their relative infancy, began to be integrated into submarine operations, enhancing navigation precision and weapons targeting. One example of this continued innovation was the development of the Mark 48 torpedo, which entered service in 1972. This weapon represented a generational advance over previous torpedoes, with wire-guided control systems allowing submarine operators to direct the weapon during its approach to the target. With a range of more than 20 miles and sophisticated homing systems, the Mark 48 could pursue and destroy any Soviet submarine of the era, even if the target attempted evasive maneuvers. This weapon system further magnified the American advantage in undersea warfare. The strategic value of the submarine fleet was demonstrated again during the Indo-Pakistani War of 1971. When intelligence indicated that the Soviet Union might intervene in the conflict, the United States dispatched the USS Enterprise carrier group to the Bay of Bengal. Less publicly, several nuclear submarines were also deployed to the region, positioning themselves where they could potentially intercept Soviet naval forces. The Soviets, detecting the carrier but unaware of the submarine deployments, exercised caution in their own naval movements. This episode illustrated how submarine capabilities, even when not directly visible, influenced strategic calculations. Throughout the early 1970s, the operational tempo of the American submarine fleet remained high. Ballistic missile submarines conducted regular deterrent patrols, typically spending about two-thirds of their operational lives at sea. Attack submarines engaged in a variety of missions, from intelligence gathering to shadowing Soviet vessels. The majority of these operations remain classified, but occasional glimpses have emerged through declassified documents and veterans' accounts. One such operation, codenamed Ivy Bells, involved the use of specially equipped submarines to place recording devices on Soviet underwater communications cables in the Sea of Okhotsk. Beginning in 1971, these extraordinarily risky missions required submarines to operate in shallow waters near the Soviet coast, placing divers who would attach sophisticated taps to the cables. The intelligence gathered from these operations was considered so sensitive that it was handled through special channels, with access restricted to a very limited group of officials. For the Soviet Union, the submarine gap continued to represent both a military challenge and a psychological wound. Despite increasing investments in their own submarine programs, they struggled to match American capabilities. Their boats remained noisier, less reliable, and more detectable than their American counterparts. According to Victor Baranets, a former Soviet military officer who later became a journalist, there was a standing joke in the Northern Fleet. What is the difference between an American and a Soviet submarine? The American one works. The gap was particularly evident in the reliability of nuclear propulsion systems. Throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, Soviet submarines experienced a series of serious reactor incidents, several of which resulted in fatalities. By contrast, the American nuclear submarine force maintained an unblemished safety record, with no reactor accidents resulting in radiation releases or personnel casualties. This disparity reflected fundamental differences in engineering approaches, safety cultures, and training methodologies. Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, the commander-in-chief of the Soviet Navy from 1956 to 1985, pushed relentlessly to close the submarine gap, channeling resources into new designs and construction facilities. Under his leadership, the Soviet Union eventually built the largest submarine fleet in the world in numerical terms, with over 200 submarines in service by the mid-1970s, compared to about 120 for the United States. However, quantity did not compensate for the persistent quality differential, particularly in the critical area of acoustic stealth. One measure of this quality gap was found in submarine patrol patterns. American ballistic missile submarines could operate in wide areas of the ocean, confident in their ability to evade detection. Soviet ballistic missile submarines, by contrast, typically remained in bastions close to Soviet territory where they could be protected by surface ships, aircraft, and attack submarines. This defensive posture reflected an acknowledgment of vulnerability, a tacit admission that their submarines could not match the stealth of their American counterparts. By 1972, as the SALT-I Agreement was signed, the strategic landscape had evolved significantly from 5 years earlier. The Soviet Union had made progress in several areas of strategic competition, particularly in land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. However, the underwater domain remained predominantly an American advantage. The 10 submarines commissioned in 1967 were now veteran vessels, having conducted numerous patrols and operations that demonstrated their capabilities in real-world conditions. For the men who served aboard these submarines, the experience shaped their lives in profound ways. Many described the unique bond that formed among submarine crews, a connection forged through shared hardship, responsibility, and the intense interdependence of underwater operations. As one officer put it, "On a submarine, your life is literally in the hands of every other person aboard." The seaman maintaining the oxygen generation system is just as crucial to your survival as the officer of the deck. This professional intimacy extended to off-duty hours as well. With minimal personal space and privacy, submariners developed customs and courtesies designed to make the confined environment tolerable. Quiet hours were strictly observed to allow sleeping crew members to rest. Personal conflicts were addressed quickly before they could affect operational effectiveness. A distinctive submarine culture emerged, characterized by technical precision, dark humor, and a certain detachment from the surface world. Captain James Watkins, who would later serve as Chief of Naval Operations, commanded the USS Snook during this period. In a 1985 interview, he reflected, "The submarine service attracts a certain type of individual, someone who can function effectively in an environment where you can't just step outside if things get difficult. You need people who can maintain their composure and effectiveness when they've been underwater for months, when they haven't seen the sun or felt fresh air or talked to their families. Not everyone can do that, but those who can develop an extraordinary resilience." This resilience was tested repeatedly during the Cold War's underwater confrontations. In October 1972, a Soviet submarine collided with the USS James Madison in the North Atlantic. The American submarine sustained minor damage, but maintained its patrol. The Soviet boat, more severely damaged, was forced to surface. This incident, not publicly acknowledged until years later, demonstrated both the ongoing cat-and-mouse game beneath the waves and the superior damage control capabilities of American submarines. The collision was not an isolated incident. Throughout the 1970s, American and Soviet submarines engaged in increasingly close surveillance of each other, resulting in several near misses and occasional contact. These encounters, conducted far from public view and rarely acknowledged officially, represented some of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War. Situations where a miscalculation or equipment failure could potentially have escalated into a wider conflict. For submarine commanders, operating in this high-stakes environment required exceptional judgment. As one former commander noted, "You're making decisions that could literally start World War III, often based on incomplete information, sometimes under extreme time pressure. The responsibility is enormous, and it never leaves you, not when you're on watch, not when you're off watch, not even when you're asleep." By 1973, the technological race had entered a new phase. The United States had begun development of the Ohio-class submarine, which would represent another quantum leap in capabilities. These vessels would be significantly larger than previous ballistic missile submarines, carrying 24 Trident missiles with much greater range and accuracy than the Polaris Poseidon systems. The first Ohio-class submarine wouldn't be commissioned until 1981, but its development signaled America's commitment to maintaining its undersea advantage indefinitely. The Soviet Union responded with its own new designs, including the Typhoon class, massive submarines that would be the largest ever built. Yet, despite these efforts, the fundamental gap in quieting technology persisted. As a CIA assessment from 1974 noted, despite significant investments and some progress in noise reduction, Soviet submarines remained substantially louder than comparable U.S. vessels. This acoustic signature difference continues to provide a crucial strategic advantage to U.S. anti-submarine warfare forces. This advantage was demonstrated dramatically during NATO Exercise Ocean Safari in 1975, when American attack submarines successfully tracked all participating Soviet vessels without themselves being detected. A classified after-action report described the exercise as a comprehensive validation of our technological superiority in the undersea domain. The strategic impact of this submarine gap extended beyond military calculations to influence broader geopolitical developments. During the Nixon and Ford administrations, the policy of détente with the Soviet Union was pursued from a position of strength in key areas, including submarine capabilities. This advantage provided American negotiators with unspoken leverage, the knowledge that, regardless of agreements reached in other domains, the United States maintained a secure second strike capability that the Soviets could not neutralize. Henry Kissinger, reflecting on this period years later, observed, "In any negotiation, what matters is not just what is on the table, but what is held in reserve." Our submarine advantage was never explicitly discussed in SALT talks, but its existence informed every aspect of the strategic dialogue. For the intelligence communities on both sides, the submarine competition generated intense activity. The United States established a specialized organization within the intelligence community focused exclusively on understanding Soviet submarine capabilities and operations. This group, drawing on data from underwater listening arrays, satellite surveillance, and human sources, produced detailed assessments of each new Soviet submarine class as it emerged. The Soviet Union, for its part, devoted enormous resources to trying to close the intelligence gap. In one notorious case, they recruited John Walker, a U.S. Navy warrant officer, who provided them with encryption keys and sensitive documents about American submarine operations from 1967 until his arrest in 1985. While damaging, even this high-level espionage couldn't overcome the fundamental technological and operational advantages the United States had established. The industrial dimension of the submarine race continued to evolve. By the mid-1970s, Electric Boat had transformed its construction methods, pioneering modular techniques that allowed submarine components to be built simultaneously in different facilities and then brought together for final assembly. This approach, which would later influence manufacturing methods in other industries, significantly reduced construction time while maintaining the exacting standards required for nuclear submarines. At the same time, the submarine supply chain had become a crucial national asset. Specialized manufacturers, many of them small to medium-sized companies located throughout the country, produced the thousands of precision components required for each vessel. These firms developed unique capabilities that couldn't be easily replicated, creating another barrier to Soviet efforts to close the gap. Admiral Hyman Rickover, testifying before Congress in 1974, emphasized this point. The submarine industrial base we have established represents not just physical facilities, but accumulated knowledge and experience that provides an enduring national advantage. The human element remained central to maintaining this advantage. The selection and training of submarine personnel continued to set the standard for military specialization. By the mid-1970s, the Navy had refined its processes for identifying individuals with the right combination of technical aptitude, psychological stability, and leadership potential for submarine service. The Nuclear Power School had expanded its capacity while maintaining its rigorous standards, ensuring a steady flow of qualified personnel to crew the growing fleet. Life aboard the submarines commissioned during the 1967 surge had settled into established routines, but the operational tempo remained demanding. Ballistic missile submarines typically operated on a cycle that kept them at sea for roughly two-thirds of each year, with crews alternating between blue and gold teams to maximize vessel utilization. Attack submarines maintained similarly intensive deployment schedules, conducting a variety of missions from intelligence gathering to fleet protection. For the families of submariners, this created unique challenges. Spouses effectively became single parents during deployments, managing households and raising children with minimal communication from their deployed partners. The Navy gradually developed support systems for these families, recognizing that family stability was crucial to maintaining the effectiveness of submarine crews. Captain William Thompson, commanding officer of the submarine base at New London, Connecticut, established one of the first formal family support programs in 1973, creating a model that would eventually be adopted throughout the Navy. The submariners themselves developed coping mechanisms for the extended separations and confined conditions. Many pursued educational opportunities during deployments, taking correspondence courses or studying for advanced degrees. Others developed hobbies that could be pursued in the limited space available: chess, model building, music. One officer aboard the USS Francis Scott Key recalled, "We had probably the world's only underwater bluegrass band. During off-watch hours, we'd gather in the crew's mess and play. The acoustics were terrible, but it gave us a connection to normal life." As the 1970s progressed, the strategic landscape continued to evolve. The Vietnam War ended, and American foreign policy adjusted to new realities. Throughout these changes, the submarine force remained a constant element of national power, a capability that provided security and leverage regardless of fluctuations in other aspects of international relations. The technological advancement didn't stop with the submarines commissioned in 1967. Each subsequent class incorporated new innovations, from improved sonar systems to more sophisticated weapons. The Los Angeles-class attack submarines, first commissioned in 1976, represented a new generation of underwater capability designed specifically to counter the growing Soviet submarine fleet. Faster, quieter, and more heavily armed than their predecessors, these vessels would form the backbone of the American attack submarine force for decades. By 1977, as the Carter administration took office, the strategic importance of submarine capabilities was well established in American defense thinking. The new president, himself a former submarine officer who had trained under Rickover, brought personal understanding of the undersea domain to policy discussions. Under Carter, funding for submarine programs remained robust despite broader defense budget constraints, reflecting the priority placed on maintaining this strategic advantage. The industrial achievement that had produced 10 submarines in a single year a decade earlier continued to influence American strategic capabilities. Those vessels were now seasoned platforms, having conducted hundreds of patrols and operations that contributed directly to national security. Their crews had accumulated invaluable experience, much of which was being systematically captured and incorporated into training for new submariners. For Soviet intelligence analysts, the submarine gap remained a source of frustration and concern. Despite significant investments and some genuine technological progress, they had not managed to close the qualitative difference. American submarines could still detect Soviet vessels at much greater ranges than they themselves could be detected, creating an asymmetry in underwater warfare capabilities that had strategic implications. This reality influenced Soviet naval doctrine, pushing them toward approaches that attempted to compensate for their disadvantages. They invested heavily in anti-submarine warfare aircraft, surface ships equipped with advanced sonar systems, and underwater surveillance networks around their key naval facilities. These measures provided some protection for their own ballistic missile submarines, but could not neutralize the threat posed by American submarines operating in the open ocean. Admiral Gorshkov, the long-serving head of the Soviet Navy, acknowledged this challenge in a classified address to the Soviet naval staff in 1977. We must recognize that in certain technical areas, particularly submarine quieting, we continue to lag behind the Americans. While we are making progress, we must adapt our operational concepts to account for this reality in the near term. This adaptation took various forms, including the establishment of heavily defended bastions in the Barents Sea and Sea of Okhotsk, where Soviet ballistic missile submarines could operate under the protection of surface ships, aircraft, and attack submarines. This strategy represented a tacit acknowledgement that their submarines could not safely operate throughout the world's oceans as American vessels did. For American submarine commanders, these Soviet defensive measures created new operational challenges but did not fundamentally alter the strategic balance. U.S. attack submarines regularly penetrated the outer defenses of these bastions during classified operations, demonstrating that even concentrated Soviet anti-submarine efforts could not reliably detect American vessels. One submarine officer who commanded the USS Batfish during operations in the Barents Sea in 1978 later described the experience: "We operated within what the Soviets considered their secure area for weeks. We could track their ballistic missile submarines coming and going from their bases, all while remaining undetected ourselves." It was the underwater equivalent of walking into someone's living room, sitting down on their couch, and watching them go about their business without them having any idea you were there. These operations were not without risk. Operating in confined waters close to Soviet territory meant navigating underwater hazards, avoiding detection by increasingly sophisticated Soviet sensors, and maintaining absolute silence for extended periods. The mental and physical demands on submarine crews during these missions were extreme, requiring intense concentration and precision for days or weeks at a time. The technological competition continued to intensify. By the late 1970s, both superpowers were investigating new approaches to submarine design and detection. The United States began exploring the use of advanced computer systems for sonar processing, allowing submarines to detect increasingly faint acoustic signatures. Research into non-acoustic detection methods, using subtle changes in water temperature, salinity, or even the Earth's magnetic field disturbed by a submarine's passage, showed promise, but remained less reliable than traditional sonar. The Soviet Union, recognizing that it could not match American quieting technology in the short term, pursued alternative approaches. They investigated the use of titanium for submarine hulls, allowing their vessels to dive deeper than American submarines. The Alpha-class submarine, first deployed in 1977, could operate at depths below 2,000 feet, significantly deeper than its American counterparts. This capability provided some tactical advantages, but did not overcome the fundamental vulnerability created by the Alpha's relatively noisy propulsion system. As the decade drew to a close, the strategic significance of the submarine competition was underscored by its prominence in the SALT II negotiations. The treaty, signed in 1979 but never ratified by the U.S. Senate, included specific provisions limiting submarine-launched ballistic missiles, recognition of their crucial role in the strategic balance. The negotiating history revealed continuing Soviet concerns about American advantages in this domain, particularly as development of the Ohio-class and Trident missile system progressed. The submarine gap that had opened with the commissioning of 10 submarines in a single year had evolved, but not disappeared. American submarines continued to maintain a decisive advantage in the critical area of acoustic stealth, allowing them to detect Soviet vessels at much greater ranges than they themselves could be detected. This asymmetry, combined with superior weapons, sensors, and crew training, ensured that the United States maintained the upper hand in undersea warfare throughout the Cold War. For the men who built and operated these submarines, the achievement represented more than military power. It was a contribution to international stability. The deterrent effect of a secure second strike capability embodied in ballistic missile submarines that could not be preemptively destroyed helped prevent the Cold War from turning hot. The attack submarines that shadowed Soviet vessels gathered intelligence that improved understanding of adversary capabilities and intentions, reducing the risk of miscalculation. Commander Harvey Lyon, who served aboard 3 different nuclear submarines during this period, expressed this perspective in a 1990 interview. "We didn't think about it in these terms at the time. We were focused on our immediate responsibilities, on doing our jobs with absolute precision. But looking back, I believe we were part of something historic." The submarine force helped maintain a balance of power that prevented a Third World War. That's a legacy to be proud of. This legacy extended beyond the military domain to influence American industry, science, and education. The technologies developed for the submarine program found applications in civilian sectors, from nuclear power generation to computer systems. The management and quality control methods pioneered by Admiral Rickover influenced practices throughout American industry. The educational programs established to train submarine personnel became models for technical education in other fields. The industrial mobilization that had produced 10 submarines in a single year demonstrated American manufacturing capabilities at their peak, a reminder of what was possible when national resources were focused on a clear objective, with adequate funding and leadership. This achievement, born of Cold War necessity, represented not just military power but the broader strengths of American society, technological innovation, industrial capacity, and the ability to attract and develop extraordinary human talent. As the Cold War entered its final decade, the submarines commissioned during the 1967 surge were approaching the end of their operational lives, but the advantage they had established continued. New generations of submarines incorporated even more advanced technologies, maintaining and in some areas extending American superiority in the undersea domain. The Soviet Union never fully closed the submarine gap. Even their most advanced vessels of the 1980s remained detectably louder than their American counterparts. This persistent disadvantage influenced Soviet strategic calculations throughout the Cold War. and may have contributed to their eventual willingness to pursue arms control and, ultimately, a fundamental reassessment of the competition itself. When the Cold War ended with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, the submarine force that had played such a crucial role in maintaining American security began a transition to new missions and challenges. Many of the vessels were eventually decommissioned, their reactor cores removed, and their hulls recycled. But the legacy of their achievement, the industrial mobilization that had so shocked Soviet intelligence in 1967, remains an important chapter in the history of the Cold War, a demonstration of how technological and industrial superiority can translate into strategic advantage. For the historians, strategists, and naval officers who study this period, the submarine race offers important lessons about the relationship between technological innovation, industrial capacity, and national security. The gap that opened when America commissioned 10 nuclear submarines in a single year was not just about numbers. It reflected deeper strengths that proved difficult for the Soviet system to match. In the long competition between different political and economic systems, this episode illustrated the enduring importance of innovation, quality, and the development of human capital. The strategic significance of this achievement has been somewhat obscured by the secrecy that necessarily surrounded submarine operations during the Cold War. Much of what these vessels did remains classified even today, acknowledged only in general terms or through unofficial channels. But for those who understand the realities of submarine warfare and deterrence theory, the importance of the industrial and technological breakthrough is clear. Admiral James Watkins, who rose from submarine command to become Chief of Naval Operations, summarized this perspective in a 1989 speech. The margin of advantage we established in submarine technology and operations represented one of the most significant military asymmetries of the entire Cold War. That this advantage was largely invisible to the public makes it no less important to the outcome of the long competition with the Soviet Union for the intelligence officers who monitored these developments on both sides. The submarine gap provided a window into broader patterns of competition between the superpowers. The American ability to translate technological innovation into operational capability more quickly and effectively than the Soviet Union could was demonstrated repeatedly in the submarine domain. This pattern would be replicated in other areas, from precision-guided munitions to computer technology, contributing to the eventual Western victory in the Cold War. In the final analysis, the achievement of commissioning 10 nuclear submarines in a single year represented more than industrial capacity. It demonstrated a system capable of mobilizing resources, talent, and innovation toward a strategic objective. The submarines that emerged from this effort helped shape the history of the Cold War, contributing to a delicate balance of power that, despite numerous crises and tensions, never collapsed into direct conflict between the superpowers. For the men and women who made this achievement possible, the engineers, shipyard workers, nuclear technicians, submarine crews, and countless others, it was a contribution to history that deserves to be remembered and understood. In the silent depths of the world's oceans, they helped write a crucial chapter in one of history's most consequential geopolitical competitions, demonstrating how technological superiority can translate into strategic advantage and, ultimately, contribute to international stability.